This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is elephants. Are they a keystone species? What is their relation to ecology? And I have two people who are experts on the matter, and we will be talking about this. Colin Bell and Ian Mickler join me. They are both based out of Southern Africa. We will be talking about elephants. As I usually like to do before we get into the topic, I like to give my guests a few minutes to just give a little background about themselves. So let me start with Ian Mickler. Ian, if you could just give a little background about who you are, things you've written, or organizations that you belong to regarding elephants, and maybe an opening thought on the topic.
Yeah, well, hi Dan, and thanks for having us. So my background is in business and finance. I spent my first career as a stockbroker and a partner in one of the biggest firms operating in South Africa back in the 1980s. I then left because I had all sorts of reservations about the sustainability of the economic models at the time, and ended up in the Okavango Delta in Botswana. And since then, I've spent the last 30 plus years, 35 years almost, involved in ecotourism. I'm the founding partner and senior director of an inbound travel operation in the ecotourism sector. We cover 16 countries across Africa. I'm the author of 9 books on various topics in Africa. The most recent, called Living in Two Worlds, Addressing Humanity's Greatest Challenge, is all about the sustainability challenges we face across the planet. And more recently, I went back to Stellenbosch University and did a postgrad in sustainable development studies. And so I'm now a research associate at Stellenbosch University. I'm also involved with corridor conservation initiatives, where we're trying to channel the movement of a single elephant that is left in the Eden National Park in the coast of South Africa, all the way across to Addo Elephant National Park. So we're linking various protected areas through an ecological corridor. But the flagship is one elephant that is left, only one animal that is left. And then I work also closely with Colin on the Conservation Action Trust, which is a group of like-minded journalists, academics, activists that campaign actively against trophy hunting as a conservation tool. And we campaign actively against the introduction of trade in wildlife, specifically rhino horn and ivory, as a solution to solve the poaching crises.
And your organization is called Invent Africa?
My tourism operation is called Invent Africa, yes. The corridor conservation is Eden to Addo, and then with Colin on the Conservation Action Trust.
And that brings me to Colin Bell. Colin, if you could give a little background about who you are, your involvement in elephants, and anything else you want to start to open.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having us. It's an important topic. Yeah, my name's Colin Bell. I live now in Cape Town, but I went to university and did a degree in economics. And at my very first 101 law and my very first accounts 101 and my very first economics 101, I realized, oh, this is not for me. Anyway, I persevered and graduated and was the luckiest guy in the world. I ended up in 1977, having my first job as a guide in the Okavango Delta. And I've been involved ever since. So it's 40-something years in the tourism eco space. And yeah, in the process, I've started a few tourism companies. My company in Dow is a company called Natural Selection. We have 24 different lodges in Namibia and Botswana mainly, one down in South Africa. And I've just been one of these very fortunate folks to have seen sort of rhinos and elephants over the time and over the decades. And we've seen their behavior, how it's changed when, in the positive way, when things are working for them, and how their behavior changes when poaching is rife and hunting is rife. We've watched this space over decades. We've run a whole lot of different concessions. Today we control around about over 1 million hectares of prime wildlife land. and we manage that in a very, very soft, conservative way. No hunting involved, and we primarily work with communities. So most of our work is done in partnership with local communities, where we make them a stakeholder. They often our landlord, and so we've really had a lot of experience going back to the 90s, where we started some of the very first partnerships between governments, communities in remote rural areas, and the private sector. And we've learned through time what works and what doesn't work. And it's these relationships between local people in rural areas and the amount of benefits they can create out of wildlife, which is almost critical to the future of wildlife and elephants in particular going into the future. And those lessons were hard lessons. Sometimes we made mistakes, but generally we kind of sat down and we listened. And when you work with local communities in rural areas, it's remarkable how when they see wildlife as their asset, how they in turn then look after and protect that particular wildlife and that particular resource. So yeah, we've had a long career in this industry, learned firsthand what works and what doesn't. And over time, I've done a book with, which is a collaborative book called The Last Elephants, with a guy called Dr. Pinnock. Don is a good friend of ours, and he's part of our CAT initiative, the Conservation Action Trust, and other little books here and there. But I think my sort of real prime interest over the time has been these prime species, rhinos and elephants, and how poaching and how trade in particular on these two. And that kind of reverts back to the economic background I was fortunate to have. Even though I hated economics and I hated the accounts and all that type of stuff, it's given me a really good grounding. We were able to apply that to the economics of wildlife trade, the economics of rhino trade. Does rhino horn trade work or does it not work? And the same with elephants. Does the trade in ivory work for the benefit of elephants, or is it to its detriment? And how you trade, whether it's through poaching, through hunting, and all the rest of it. I think between you and myself, we've got some pretty good first-hand, hard-earned sort of time at the coalface, which from that time at the coalface, we kind of applied to where we are today.
So historically, there were probably a few dozen types of proboscideans. We're down to like 3 now, the 2 in Africa, 1 in India. Bush and forest in Africa, and then the Indian subcontinent and all around the Bay of Bengal. Do those 3 species, are they all suffering the same type of fate, or are there individual fates? Like do the Asian elephants, are they used more for like spells and incantations and medicinal stuff, whereas the elephants in Africa are hunted more for trophies? What of the 3 types of elephants that are extant, what are particular to each of them, the issues?
So if we divide the planet up, you've got your Asians, you've got your forest in Africa, and you've got your savanna in Africa. There are around about 70,000 70,000 forest elephants in Africa, and they're mainly in West Africa. They're in the deep forests. They're much more difficult to count, so the number 70,000 is very approximate. You can't fly big, long transects over these forests and count down because you can't see through the forest. But around about 70,000, maybe 50,000 forest elephants left. And then the savanna elephants, they're around about, call it about 320,000 savanna elephants. Those are the elephants found mainly in East Africa all the way through to Southern Africa. And they've taken a pounding over the years. If you go back in history, we must have had sort of 100 years ago about 2 million elephants in Africa. Today we've got 300 and something thousand savanna elephants, and that is a combination of commercial poaching and trophy hunting. The combination of those two has been lethal. And Ian and I, over the time, let's say from our early days in the Okavango Delta, I can remember in the 70s and the 80s when we saw a group of female elephants in particular in that direction, we went in the opposite direction. They were being poached to smithereens. They were getting hammered from trophy hunting, and their behavior was super stressed, off the charts. And as soon as they saw a human being, they went for you. And we've watched over time as the poaching has either got under control or the hunting has been reduced or been banned, how the elephant behavior has changed, and also how their numbers have increased or decreased. And there's no question when there is no demand, in other words, when the world's got together and the world has stopped all trade and had a unified ban, which happened in 1989 and 1990, when the world got together mainly as a following the lead of President Moi in Kenya and Richard Leakey. They went to the States, which at that time was the main consumer of ivory products. Just about every woman coming to Africa had a nice, big, fat elephant necklace or a wristband or something like that. Elephant products were everywhere, and the US was the main consumer. And President Moi and Richard Leakey went around the States, and they absolutely made trade in ivory absolutely non-sexy. Eventually, there was almost a complete ban in 1989, where the elephant products around the world were put onto CITES forbidden lists, and the trade stopped. And with no trade and no demand, there was no poaching. And suddenly, for the first time, elephant numbers started to increase. And with them increasing, and there was less poaching and almost no poaching, the elephant behavior calmed down extraordinarily. To the extent in that period going into the 90s and the 2000s, when elephant behavior, you could be sitting out in the plains, you'd have elephants around you, absolutely behaving as they should have been doing, as opposed to the 70s and the 80s where they were stressed out of hell, and they literally came and smashed your vehicles. We had a competitor, we started a business in 83, and in about 84, 85, we had a competitor startup with a lot of money. He came from a family with a lot of cash, and he had the best of everything. He started this business with the best marketing, the best vehicles, the best equipment, and here we are trying to survive with our sort of rickety old Ford control Land Rovers. And we were okay, we were doing well, but this guy really was a threat for us. And his first safari, in fact, his was sold out. And on his very first safaris, the guests flew into Maun, he picked them up there, and he drove to Moremi Game Reserve, checked into Moremi Game Reserve, and he was 100 meters into Moremi Game Reserve when he saw this group of female elephants. Now, we had the experience, and we went in that direction. He stayed put, and this matriarch came up to him and put the tusks on either side of his radiator, rattled the vehicles around for about 100 meters, a further 100 meters. And there were lots of bruised bodies, and nobody died, fortunately. But that safari company lasted one day, because at that time elephants were stressed out of hell. And today, I say, we went through a bit of a blip where South Africa got together in 2008 and started to trade. And we went to the South African government, went to the world and said, we want to go and sell our ivory stocks, which we've collected over the years, which are all due to mortality. And said to the world, listen, we want to go and sell our ivory stocks, and we want to make sure that we'll put the money towards conservation. And there was about 108 tons, which they sold mainly to China. We opened up a whole lot of carving businesses around China, and suddenly there was a legal outlet for ivory. And from that legal outlet, the poaching syndicate said, fantastic, we've now got an opportunity to launder illegal ivory into a legal market, and poaching went through the roof. And so did elephant behavior start to go and change. And so we've seen these trends over time. When elephants were calm, when they were being well looked after, with no ivory trade around the world, how they calmed down and everything was good. And we've seen before that in the 70s and 80s and the 80s how there's absolute chaos out there in the elephant world. And then subsequently, more recently, since the elephant censuses of 2013, how matters have calmed down again, particularly once the Chinese had stopped all their ivory outlets. And suddenly there was no market again, or very little market. So yeah, Ian and I have had this period of watching elephants under stress, elephants under normal situations, and all these good things.
Ian, let me just pick up on what he said about the stress, because in the media, what you hear about is the poaching of the older bulls, and you basically have the equivalent, I guess, of elephant teenagers doing what teenagers usually do when they get into must. Has that been a big problem? Have people been hurt in that manner?
Well, if you're a poacher and if you're a trophy hunter, you're going to go after the bulls with the heaviest ivory. So, you get more dollars for your effort. So we are across Africa losing the biggest tuskers to poaching and to trophy hunters, as Colin said. I mean, so let's be clear about this. Trophy hunting is a bigger problem in terms of losing the gene pool. The trophy hunters are not taking nearly as many elephants as the poachers are, but they are going after the gene pool. Yes, if you take out the mature bulls, and all you leave are teenage elephants, young males, the social dynamics get disrupted significantly. And there's been some fascinating real-life cases of those. One here in South Africa, where a group of teenagers literally went on a rampage and damaged cars, killed rhino. And the only way they could alleviate that was to reintroduce some really big mature bulls, who then, kind of calmed the whole social structure down. So losing the gene pool, losing the mature bulls to poaching and trophy hunting is very, very problematic in the long term for social dynamics of the population.
How about with the ivory? I know that they have cut off the horns of some rhinos to stop poaching that. Is there any way to like spray paint some of the ivory tusks to sort of not, they still be functional for the elephant, but this would deter poachers?
No, not that I'm aware of. That. So first of all, can you imagine the effort and the energy and the funding required to track down 25,000 mature bull elephants across the continent, and including both forest and savanna. Secondly, the elephants make use of their tusks all the time. So the chances are that coloring would wear off quite quickly and all be covered over by tannins from, the way they dig up roots, strip bark, rub against trees. And ivory is way too dense to inject any material into the tusk itself. So, no, that's not a solution. That's not a viable solution.
How about, let me ask both of you, Colin, I'll start with you. In the U.S. here with the hunting of whales, for example, one of the things is they've allowed a few whales to be hunted for indigenous cultures, but anyone else, they face penalties and whatnot. Are the poachers in Africa for the elephants, are they poor people who need this money to subsist, or are they the richer people who are just making a bundle, selling it to China or wherever?
So generally, there's going to be portions of society who will be of all levels of society, but most of the poaching now is driven by the international criminal gangs, the international criminal businesses. And these businesses, they've got everything. They're into drugs, people trafficking, heroin, rhino horn, ivory poaching, the whole bang shoot. And that's where the vast majority of the poaching is taking place. And that's why it's very important that China closed down those ivory carving businesses of theirs, because there you have the legal outlet. So at the moment, there's no real big legal outlet in Asia anymore. So we're seeing a calming down of situation, but there's still a fair number of countries where ivory sales are still legal or tolerated, or because there's been historical amounts of legal trade with a whole lot of CITES permits sort of floating around, that the poachers are working through the international criminal syndicates who have access to these permits and then use that as a legal way to get into the market. So a big chunk, the vast majority of the poaching is being driven by the international criminal syndicates with access directly into the markets in Asia. Sure, there's a little bit of meat poaching going on in Africa here and there, and there's the odd little poaching incident which is not driven ultimately through the international markets into China primarily, but it's a minority.
So Dan, can I just add something on that? It's interesting. In 2012, I was tasked by a global international NGO to investigate the ivory trade that was taking place in Tanzania at the time, because there were reports that Tanzania was losing significant numbers of elephants, particularly out of Selous Game Reserve. And I spent 6 weeks in Selous and in Dar es Salaam. And what was interesting is that there was very clearly, and part of that session was I met with intelligence agents from France and the UK. And it was very clear that the links between the ivory smugglers, the ivory poachers, the smugglers, the syndicates that Collins referred to, and the piracy that was going on along the East African coast and up in the Gulf at that stage. I don't know if you remember the piracy problems that Africa had. And those security agents were very clearly able to link the ivory trade to some of those piracy organizations and, the sale of ivory for weapons and so on. So, yeah, just to support what Colin was saying, the links between these syndicates, and all forms of illegal activity, money laundering, the whole bang shoot.
Just to be clear, when you talk about criminal syndicates, are we talking about like the Russian mob, the mafia, the Yakuza in Japan? Are we talking about actual organized criminal gangs that sell it, or are these just localized in Africa that then deal?
No, we're talking about criminal syndicates. So as far as I'm aware, the mafia are not involved in ivory or rhino poaching. They're mostly Asian-based syndicates because that's where the big markets are. And typically what happens is you will have a syndicate. The syndicate will be split into two. So in the point of sale, which is typically in Asia, but can be in places like New York as well. And then on the continent, you'll have the second half of the syndicate, and you'll have the syndicate boss, and then a variety of underlings right down to the poachers themselves. And the poachers get paid very little. They take all the risk, or most of the risk, and they get paid very little. And of course, the price increases as you go up. But the most important part of the head of the syndicate in Africa is that they must cultivate the political connections or the logistical connections with port authorities, with politicians and the police, because ivory is, unlike rhino horn, it's your dollar is in a small parcel, 4 to 6 kilos. Ivory is significantly larger, and the amount of money you're going to get per kilo is much reduced. So the risks of moving ivory from the Selous, for example, all the way up to, and Dar es Salaam is not the major export port there. Mombasa is, but some of it actually ends up going to places like Uganda and Burundi. But so it's in significantly larger amounts and size, and so the syndicate head must cultivate very important links, and through corrupt associations with port authorities, with police, and with politicians to allow the shipment to take place.
So we're talking about government corruption in these assorted countries that are getting politicians getting paid off and turning a blind eye to it.
There are examples, yes.
So,
go ahead. You looks like you want to say something, Colin. Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, so we're focusing on the poaching, and remember we went through some heavy periods. I mean, that period between 2008 and 2013 when the big last great elephant census happened was a catastrophic period. Something like 60% of all Tanzania's elephants were lost, same with Mozambique, and we had this massive sort of decline all around, following on from the legal sale of the 2008, which kind of opened up everything. But since the Chinese have shut down their ivory shops and their carving shops, it's really been quite remarkable how the poaching levels have almost not dissipated to zero, but they've really reduced to kind of almost manageable levels. And I say that sort of guardedly because so long as they're breeding, if you look around Africa today, suddenly we're seeing now in East Africa, Kenya in particular, we're seeing the elephant numbers increasing. They haven't increased for decades to decades. Now we're suddenly seeing a reversal. We're seeing East Africa going up a bit. Tanzania went through some terrible times. It's kind of stabilizing. Botswana's numbers are fairly flat. maybe even fractionally decreasing a bit. In South Africa, we had a slight increase. So compared to the catastrophic periods where we were losing literally an elephant every 15 minutes, the situation today is actually a much more better controlled situation. And it's important because the market, the main big market, has dried up. And without the market and very little demand, the poaching does decrease. And the criminal syndicates then go to other products which are more in demand.
So I want to talk a little bit about elephants as a species and their role in the environment and what would change if they were to go extinct. And we can talk about all three types of major elephants. I've done 3 prior shows on beavers, the American bison, and wolves, and this is the first animal that's outside of the North American sphere. And also, of those 4 animals, elephants are probably the only ones that could be considered sentient creatures. I mean, in terms of having a higher degree of knowledge than, say, a beaver or a wolf. What role do they play? Obviously, elephants are the largest land animals extant. So beavers help with water management. Wolves cull the sick and keep a whole biome more healthy. And bison are the top herbivores in North America. Do elephants play a role in say the forming of the land, the keeping of the savannas flat, in conserving carbon and that kind of thing? Because I've read, for example, they have a thing in Siberia trying to bring back the mammoths because they think that tramping down on the Arctic tundra could actually help save more carbon and methane from getting into the air. So what is the role of the 3 forms of elephants in their environments in terms of keeping the environment healthy? Either one of you.
You want me to go, Cole? Yeah. Okay, so I'll keep it short because it's very simple. Yes, elephants play an absolutely essential role in the environment, and those of us who live and work amongst elephants actually refer to them as the landscape architects, and they are accorded the concept of a keystone species, which means that if you remove them from that environment, there is a very noticeable degradation process that starts taking place. And so, the primary functions they play is that they, as these landscape architects, they keep woodland from growing over and becoming thickets. If that happens, then that terrain becomes closed off for a whole variety of other species, not only other mammals, but even birds, insects, and so on. So they keep woodlands thinned, which provides a lot more space, movement, habitat, food sources for a whole variety of species. And then, of course, they probably, as far as mammals go, the most important species for seed dispersal. So you can track elephant migratory paths historically through the dispersal or the growth patterns of particular species of trees. In Botswana, where Colin and I have worked a lot of the time, palm trees, for example, are a very good example of that. But there's a whole variety of species that you can track them through. So yeah, they play vital roles, very important roles.
Colin?
And if I take it from a totally different perspective, if you look at the map of Africa, sadly the way the maps are drawn, when you look at Africa, it looks as kind of the same size as the US, it looks the same kind of size as South America, and it looks as kind of the same size as Europe. But when you actually take the continent of Africa, you can put the whole of the US, and you can put the whole of China, and you can put the whole of Japan, and you can put the whole of Europe, and the UK, and you still have space left over. And what I'm coming to is that in Africa, we've got these massive amounts of undisturbed, pristine grasslands in particular, and also forests. And people think about carbon sequestration. And they think it's just generally in the Amazon and in the Congo Basin. But no, most of the carbon is actually sequestered into the soils. And the planet needs these huge amounts of savannas kept in pristine condition. And when they're in pristine condition, they can keep the carbon stored there. But as soon as humanity comes in, as soon as we have buildings, as soon as we have villages, as soon as we have livestock, the soil loses the ability to now store carbon. And what Africa is, if you can think of this gigantic continent, with the whole of America, the whole of China, and we're taking a lot of your pollution and we are processing it in Africa, in our soils. But the problem is we don't have the finances in our countries to sustain the parks and pay for the parks willy-nilly. We do need tourism. And COVID was a very good example of how once you cut off tourism, you're suddenly cutting off the funding for the management of parks in Africa, and you're cutting off the funding for conservation, and you're cutting off the funds for people who are living around the parks to survive. Tourism has now gone from, in the sort of 80s and 90s, tourism was regarded after mining as the second most extractive industry in Africa. It's now gone the other way around. Tourism is now the single biggest funder of conservation and of the management of our parks. And if we don't have tourism, we're not going to be able to fund our parks and keep them in pristine condition so our soils can take the planet's carbon and keep it sequestered in our soils. And what do we need for tourism? We need our key species. So we need all our elephants, we need our rhinos, we need our big cats. But the elephant is the kind of key species of the whole lot. It's the biggest and it does the most amount of, as Ian says, the most amount of seed dispersal and all this type of stuff. But we need a full, intact environment to attract tourism in decent enough numbers to pay for the conservation, pay for the management through the park fees and through all the different things. And if we lose elephants, we do lose tourism. And we do lose tourism, we lose the mechanism to fund our parks. So if we want climate change to be arrested, you've got to first and foremost look at Africa. And there's this whole flight shaming story around the world. And I 100% agree. If you want to go from Berlin through to Barcelona, or if you want to go from the US, from say New York to Boston, hop on a train, don't fly. But for Africa, we've got to have a flight shaming exemption because we need tourism. We need people to fly here to come and see species like elephants. If we lose elephants, we lose tourism, and then we're going to lose our parks. We're going to lose our ability to sequester your pollution.
Colin, I just want to pick up on it. You mentioned the map of Africa, and we can visualize it. So the range of the Asian elephant, at least the savanna, and I guess even maybe the forest elephant, is all the way from South Africa in the south. Is it right up to the Sahel?
Yeah, it goes all the way from South Africa through Zambia, Tanzania, a little bit of Mozambique, all the way up to Kenya, and then as far as north as up into Chad. Zukuma National Park, an extraordinary example of wonderful efforts of elephant, of how conservation and tourism has gone in there and saved the elephants. I mean, Zukuma in Chad, of all places, when you think about Africa and you think about elephants, the last place you think of is this desert and the Sahara. And Chad comes to mind. But if you go to Zukuma National Park, in the sort of southeastern corner of Chad, I mean, they had the most extraordinary elephant story where they had around about 100, if you go back sort of 25 years ago, they had about 120,000 elephants. And those elephants were smashed by the rebels coming through from Sudan. And they'd come across on their horses and they'd they would just carve these elephants apart for their ivory, for commercial smuggling to go back into Asia. And African parks came in and put in a huge security component, brought in a tourism model, and they, from 120,000 elephants, they went down to about 420 elephants when African parks took over a decade ago. And at that stage, all of those 400 and something elephants were walking shoulder to shoulder. They dared not move out and behave like elephants normally do, with family groups here and there. Those 400 and something elephants, there was a two-generation, there was not a single elephant below 15 years because of the trauma which had been imposed by all this poaching. and African parks came in, settled it all down, made sure that the poaching was stopped. And those elephants are now started breeding up. They're up to about 600-700. There's a whole lot of youngsters around. So yes, our savanna elephants go all the way up to Chad, and they were so close. They were at the brink of extinction. And I'd hate to think of what could have happened to Zukuma Park if that had happened, because it would have been completely off the tourism radar. And it would have been, I think it would have been on the last legs and would have probably been given up as a derelict park. So they go all the way up that way, and then across towards all the way through to just before Central African Republic. And then you start to get the Congo Basin and the forests of West Africa, and you start to get the forest elephants, which just look slightly differently. The ivory is a lot straighter, and some of the biggest ivory ever came out of the forests. And it's also the hardest, so it's the easiest to carve, and it's got the best carving potential. So the forest elephants were hugely under pressure because of poaching, because of the quality of the ivory. So yeah, so West Africa, which is primarily forest elephants, and then from South Africa all the way up to Chad, along the east mainly, where we have the savannas.
The reason I ask is if elephants are so important in maintaining their environment, if elephants were to disappear along the Sahel, would that accelerate the rate of the expansion of the Sahara southward?
I don't think anybody's ever done studies that far, but sure. Ian, what do you reckon? I don't think elephants.
The elephants that occur now along the Sahelian region are in such small numbers that they've already been decimated. So as Colin has pointed out, in Chad and Mali as well, I've seen the Malian population, and I literally, if I remember, they're down to like 30 elephants. I mean, so, you know, those are savanna elephants. So I think the role that they play in, or would have played 100 years ago, I think has now been so diminished. You know, and it's more now in Southern and East Africa. I mean, Southern Africa has 70% of Africa's elephants. East Africa has about 20%, and then, as Colin pointed out earlier, you know, Central and West Africa, between them, no more than 10%. So it's the Southern African and the East African populations that are still significant and still playing that keystone role. To a lesser extent, Central and West Africa.
You mentioned about the criminal syndicates that are basically the fuel that propels the trade in ivory. I'm wondering what are the solutions that government can do. Governments, you mentioned a couple of governments, Colin, that went in and had the park system, but you said that they needed monetary things. I wanted to ask, getting back to the idea of sentience. I know that in New Zealand and in Australia, they've had poaching problems for various species here and there as well. Certainly nothing as big and large as an elephant. But one of the things that they have done to deter that is they've used the native, the Maori and the Aboriginals' ideas of personhood being extended to animals to provide added criminal penalties to, say, poaching whatever animal they might want to poach. Is there any sort of movement like that to extend personhood to elephants or to other endangered creatures, that there would be a greater or as equal a penalty for killing an elephant as it is for killing a human being?
Can I just go back on one point there, Dan? It's not the criminal syndicates which are driving it, it's demand.
Okay, yeah.
Demand, okay. When people in first world countries or in the new China with this massive middle class, when people demand the product, that's when the criminals step in to fill the demand. Yeah. So it's all about demand. You take away demand, make it illegal, have a ban around the world, take away demand, and poaching diminishes. The criminal syndicate seize on an opportunity and fulfill the opportunity. Whether you're a druggie, whether you want to move to new countries, all those type of things. It's all about demand. If you can stop the demand, then a lot of things happen. I mean, if you look at China today and talking about penalties, if you go and poach a panda it's a death sentence. It's simple. There's no debate about it. Everybody knows it. If you want to go and be executed, go and poach a panda. We don't have this down here. We're starting to see, finally, and especially in the rhino world, we're starting to see lots stiffer penalties come through. We had a fellow who was caught poaching in Kruger Park the other day, got a 22-year sentence, which is great, because finally we're starting to see a little bit of an acceptance by the authorities that these sentences have to be severe to turn away the poaching folks. Because remember, as Ian said early on, they are the foot soldiers. They're the folks who are desperate just to put food on their table. Those are the folks who, sadly in Africa, we target more the foot soldier as opposed to the syndicate leader. Whereas I think Nepal do it completely the other way around in their rhino world. I mean, you think about where Nepal is, they're so close to the market, and yet they have almost no rhino poaching. But they go for the syndicate bosses. If you're a syndicate leader in Nepal, you better be damn good, because they're going to find you. Whereas here in Africa, we normally go for the foot soldier, and foot soldiers just trying to put food on the table. And it's the wrong sort of approach. But I think, as to answer your question about whether there's kind of putting a totem type of a symbol onto an animal like an elephant, they do in some areas. In southwestern Zambia, you've got the elephant as a revered animal as far as the tribe. They move out, the Lokotula move out of the flooded areas, and they go on these massive rafts which elephants adorn them, and it's kind of like the totem. But we haven't, not to the extent of what you're saying. There's this, in certain areas, it comes down to the appreciation of local people for wildlife as an asset or a threat. If the local people see the wildlife as an asset, or elephants as an asset, most of the damage is done. If they see wildlife as a threat, then they will be poached. And when we run a program in the Okavango Delta, right in the very north, just outside the Delta, where the Okavango Delta is like this. If you can see my hand in this area over here, the elephants move north to south, but the people who live outside move east to west. And so the kids who are walking to school, they're having to walk 5 kilometers, 7 kilometers to go to school. And they were bumping into elephants, and they were getting smashed. So what we've done is we put together what we call the Elephant Express. So every morning we've got a couple of these buses which go up and down and pick up the school kids, and we move them across like that. And the rest of the day we're moving the grandmothers to the shops and stuff like that. So you take people off the streets, and that's all part of a program to get those people to understand that elephants are a source of value, and that those communities get a whole lot of revenue and all the jobs from tourism and all the rest of it. But the final threat was the fact that a lot of people were getting trampled by elephants, or harassed by elephants, or their crops were getting smashed. So part of the program is to take away the negativity by doing initiatives like this Elephant Express. And then you can have success. It's not so much just putting the totem. We've got to have a wholesale change in local people, and they've got to be brought out of the villages and brought into the boardroom. When they're in the boardroom, and they can benefit from the tourism industry, from the wildlife industry at scale, then we've got a chance.
Ian, do you have any comment on that?
No, I'm in agreement with Colin. Is that so? Demand is a significant challenge and a significant problem, and if we can deal with that, it absolutely exacerbates the issue down the line. I think just to add to significant problems that we deal with in worldwide, but it's particularly prevalent in Africa, is corruption at the level of officialdom. So, and as long as we elect leaders, or we have leaders that are not prepared to clamp down on that, or are themselves involved, it's always going to be a problem. And then lower down the line, the other significant challenge we face is that the pressures on our wildlife resources, and poaching being a significant one, are linked to the socio-economic issues or challenges we face. And so if you look at the history of Africa and these wild areas, they are directly linked and associated to the settlement patterns, the exploitation of resources, development of agricultural mining, and then, of course, in the end, the national parks and the forced removals of so many people to make way for these parks. And the result has been that we have millions and millions of people who are mostly impoverished. Also, many of them are alienated by this process that's gone on for over 100 years now. And when you've got people who are in that state, political and economic, then it's a significant challenge, because as long as there's a few dollars to be made from poaching ivory or horn or whatever, of course they will do it. So, the solutions are directly linked to also trying to solve our social economic development challenges in rural Africa.
Is this sort of a remnant leftover problem from colonialism too? I mean, is there a direct line from them?
No, I mean, 100%. It's not remnant. It's significant. I mean, so the work that I do and Colin does as ecotourism operators, as conservationists, as journalists, as activists, is direct. We're dealing with the consequences of the political and economic paradigms that played out over the 1800s and most of the 1900s. It was the patterns of development, it was the alienation process, it was the disempowerment and the impoverishment of these communities. And the bizarre, and this is what I find utterly bizarre about this whole process, is that these governments and the business or the economic community, they look to ecotourism and conservation to be the salvation to this sort of social economic development that should have taken place over the last 100 years but hasn't. And it's simply not going to happen. It's not possible, and it's not going to happen. So what it tells me is that our challenges are significant. And yeah, so as long as you've got hungry people, impoverished people, alienated people, then and no one's doing anything to truly sort out the problems in terms of their development, we're going to have poaching's going to be with us. But as Colin said in the beginning, and I'm supporting him, is that we can reduce it significantly if we work at the demand side. We reduce corruption. And ecotourism does their bit. I mean, if it wasn't for ecotourism, there would be a free-for-all right now. So, ecotourism has become the most significant block in this, but it's not. I mean, we're like a band-aid. We need governments to come to the party. We need the corporate world to come to the party. We need NGOs, aid agencies. Everyone has to buy in.
So, is there anything with the United Nations or the formally, what is their position on ending poaching of not only elephants but the rhinos and other creatures like that?
Well, it's all hodgepodge, So as Colin said earlier, these that up until now, and we're starting to see a change, but the legal systems, for example, the prosecutorial processes, the fines or the punishments have not been commensurate with the crimes. First of all. Second of all, because of corruption, the UN can lay down, or the IUCN, whoever it might be, can lay down all sorts of thoughts, ideas, rules, regulations, or recommendations. But if corruption is rife, then that none of that actually happens, or it gets completely diluted. So the global conservation efforts take place through the IUCN. Which is, that's where all your protocols and your conventions are laid out, and then of course governments sign on and ratify it. But they're not obligatory. There's no court system that, for example, beholds any country that's a signatory to the Heritage Commission or to the Kyoto Protocol, for example. The challenge at the coalface, which is where the two of us are involved in, is significant because, we're toothless in many ways,
Can I just pick up on that, Dan? I think the key to follow on from what Ian's saying, I think our biggest problem, if you look at, say, where the funding comes for governments to fund conservation, if you look at probably the best funded organization in Africa is the South African National Parks. In local terms, it's a 3 billion rand organization. They run 20-something parks around South Africa, Kruger Park being the most famous, Table Mountain, the rest. So they run whole 20-something parks, only 3 are profitable. But if you look at their funding, out of the 3 billion rand, which is needed to, to fund the organization, only 22% comes from government. 78% comes from tourism in the form of concessions, park fees, and all the rest of it. Now, that's the best funded organization in Africa. You go to other countries and other organizations where 100% of their funding is coming from the private sector through park fees and concession fees. And why is that the situation? It's because the first world and the developed world has never ever taken a part of its funding thought processes and funding stories to contribute to the maintenance of what is essentially a global asset. So if you take a park like any park in Africa, especially in the more remote areas, take Karamba Park in the DRC Congo. In Karamba, I mean, there's not 1 cent which goes in from the government. They might give a little bit of moral support here and there, but that park and all the other parks collectively are doing so much good for the planet in terms of biodiversity, in terms of climate change and all the rest of it. And one of the biggest mechanisms we've got on the planet to compensate for these type of pristine environments is carbon. So there's a whole carbon market out there. But a carbon market does not recognize national parks or parks which have been conserved. So you can't go and claim carbon from a Rhine-Ruhr polluter or a Detroit polluter because it's really protected. The only time where carbon really has got value is when you're going to go and take a piece of land which is buggered and you want to fix it up and then convert it into pristine. Then you can get carbon credits. But these African countries are getting nothing from the international carbon world for protecting vast tracts of Africa. And I come back to the size of it. And what we're doing for global pollution, for climate change, is enormous, but they're not being rewarded zero. We've got to relook at this carbon market. We've got to allow a carbon facility to start taking place to reward African countries for keeping land pristine. And once we do that, then we've got a real chance. Because now you're incentivizing governments to look after the land. At the moment, besides a bit of tax and a bit of this and a bit of that, and you've got the colonial side of things and the negativity associated there, there's no real incentive for African governments to get involved and spend good hard-earned tax. They'd rather just leave it up to the private sector and some park fees and for the tourism sector to just do its bit. But as we saw under COVID, my goodness, there are big, big issues when the tourism fund dries up, and we need to change that. And carbon is the easiest single way. We need to have money going to African countries to allow them to start marketing around the world, and we need carbon. If the first world can start doing that, hell, we've got a great chance. But while we just don't give governments here incentive to keeping the land pristine, to keeping savannas pristine, to keeping the loggers out of our forests, what can we do? We don't have a chance.
What is the United States' role, if any, in this? I mean, does the U.S. wield the biggest hammer if, let's say, Bill Gates or one of these billionaires here took up the cause? Would that help a lot?
No doubt. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, philanthropy, philanthropy helps. And there's some good examples across Africa. But at the end of the day, it's not the most sustainable way of doing it. So, my long-term solution would be that, our entire education systems need to be changed, number one. So I'm talking long-term solutions here because we don't understand the value of, biodiversity. We don't understand the value of healthy ecosystem services. and we don't understand the negative role or impacts that our political and economic systems are having on this planet. So that's point number one. Point number two is that still today, even in the USA, your environmental portfolio is the lowest ranking or one of the lowest ranking portfolios amongst your cabinet postings. It's certainly like that across Africa. It's the most junior posting. It gets the least amount of funding, and it's pretty similar in the USA. Now, to me, that is the most dysfunctional approach to the environment you could ever consider, because we now know that without the healthy environment, and let's just move beyond elephants specifically, without a healthy environment, we're all not going to survive. So the next step would be to get governments, the US, but also across Africa, to promote the environmental portfolio to a priority position alongside education, alongside health, alongside military, not as the junior portfolio. And in that way, then funding should become appropriate. Right now, the African continent, the governments have abdicated their responsibility to take care of their protected areas. It's left to the ecotourism industry, it's left to committed activists, NGOs, to come up with all sorts of schemes on how to protect these areas. The government should be playing a significant role in that, because ultimately that's how our population, that's how we as individuals are going to survive. That's how humanity is going to survive. So for me, it's got to have a long-term approach. In the short term, it's exactly what Colin and I are talking to you about now. We do the very best we can with ecotourism. We look at schemes like carbon credit systems, offsets trades. We look at philanthropists funding specific projects, but again, I come back to it's the thumb in the damn wall. It's the band-aid. This needs a significant shift in our thinking, in our behavior in the long term.
I want to ask both of you for final opinions. Before I do, there's one point I wanted to bring up that might seem a little far out, but I recently saw a couple of months ago a documentary on public television here in the U.S. Where artificial intelligence was used to try to decode the language or the languages of several different pods and species of whales and local communities. I'm wondering, because I've read that elephants are supposed to have a several hundred idea or word vocabulary that they can, warn about danger or this or that. Have there been any efforts with artificial intelligence to try to decode how to communicate better with elephants? For example, with these, with the old bulls being killed off and throwing, say, a band of elephants into disarray, and as you said, being so nervous, that there's a way that we could say that there are human beings, we're not all bad, some of us are trying to help you. Do you know of any kind of thing like that they're doing with the whales?
Geez, we only learned what AI meant in Africa about a couple of weeks ago. So the guy started even thinking about the application.
I'm just throwing it out there.
AI was artificial insemination.
I'm not aware, Dan. No, it's an interesting concept to imagine, to have a system that could tell elephants that it's all okay. We're not all coming to shoot them. We're not all coming to chase them.
Because I know there was a famous story in the news about a couple of months ago about some guy, was it in Myanmar, who was abusing an elephant, and the elephant, killed the owner, and the elephant, I think, was put on trial in their legal system. It might have been Myanmar or one of the other Southeast Asian countries, and it just tied back into what I was talking about, personhood ascensions. But let me just ask you. Yeah. Let me just ask you then both any final points you want to make. Colin, if you could just wrap up with a final thought or two.
Yeah, folks, I think that this is not a one-stop silver bullet thing. We've got to look at the environment through totally different eyes. If as the planet we start to look at the environment with that this is really the center of our being, this is the foundation of all our lives, this is the foundation for everything we stand for, and this is something which is precious and needs to be nurtured. If we can start there and from there we can start thinking about the bigger picture and making sure that our parks integrate communities fully. Then we've got a chance. But if, so long as we kind of have our parks to one side and we have the first world over there and we have no carbon down here, and we, at the moment I think we on the slippery downwards slope. But we are at the point here where we do have a high road and we do have a low road. And I think we've got to start saying, okay, hang on, this junction between the high road and the low road is not going to be there for much longer. We've got to start choosing the high road. Otherwise, there isn't going to be a planet. There aren't going to be elephants, and there's not going to be life as we know it. And we know for sure, and we've seen this now coming through COVID, how there's been a surge of demand for African products. People are from the first world, from the Rhine-Ruhr, from the Detroits, from the middle of New York, are traveling to Africa at a level we've never seen before. Why? Because we all came from Africa. Every single human being came from a small band of people living very close to us in Cape Town and Plettenberg Bay, where we are. And we all have Africa in our DNA. And if we have these periods like a COVID when we don't have Africa in our bodies and we're not experiencing that peace and that wilderness, we're different people. And we need Africa. We need the healing Africa can provide. And we've got to start nurturing what we've got.
Ian, any final comment from you?
Yeah, and I'd just like to reiterate on the big picture, what I said earlier, and that is that, and like Colin has been saying as well now, is that it requires a change of attitude on a global level. We need to understand intrinsic value of ecosystems, of biodiversity. We need to understand the impacts of our current ways of living. We can no, it's not sustainable. It's clear. So that's on the big picture level. In the immediate future, I think I would like to reiterate that trade in ivory is not a solution. Trophy hunting is not a solution, and in fact, both of those are likely to exacerbate the challenges we face with protecting elephants. Trade in ivory, because all it does is it opens up an illegal trade and promotes poaching. And as Colin said earlier, there have been many examples of showing how that actually works. And with regard to trophy hunting, all they're doing is they're taking out the gene pool. So we can't afford to lose our gene pool. And let's pay tribute to the ecotourism companies that are keeping our parks and reserves going. And let's also pay tribute to many of the NGOs that have done incredible work and are doing incredible work, and the researchers that they support, the elephant researchers across the continent, in at least, keeping us up to date with what's going on and the challenges we face.
Well, I want to thank you both for spending about an hour talking about this. It was a good conversation.